Here to take this further is opinion editor Grace Ho. Grace, how is this similar or different from past national conversations about Singapore's social compact?
Well, first, it's similar in the sense that, like previous exercises, it took place at a time of economic or political challenges, and also not long before or after critical general elections. And in the minds of the public, they tend to be associated with different generations of leaders. So looking at Forward Singapore, it's led by Mr. Wong and his 4G team. And we have this backdrop of fraying social compacts around the world, high level of volatility and a protracted conflict in Ukraine, which has effects have bled over to the rest of the world. And if you look at some of the previous exercises, they were associated with leadership changes as well. The phrase "next lap" was coined when Mr. Goh Chok Tong was sworn in as PM in 1990. And then in the more recent exercises, there was our Singapore conversation, which came after a pretty bruising 2011 general election, and followed by Singapore Together, which took on a lot more salience during COVID-19 just 2 years ago. And second, each of these exercises has a roughly similar form, although they may have some variance in their scope and substance. So they ultimately, what I mean is that they converge on fairly conventional sectors, right? So we look at housing, education, manpower, and healthcare. And every exercise invariably looks at some aspects or all of these aspects. So it's not the sectors themselves that have changed, but it's the specific issues to each sector and the public's expectations of each of them that continue to evolve. In terms of the difference, I would say that in contrast to previous exercises, the latest few exercises from our Singapore conversation to Forward Singapore have tried to tap the collective wisdom of a larger and more varied group of Singaporeans. And the idea is to kind of devolve that action and that governance, beyond the usual top-down committees. There's also a shift in the quality of the tone of the conversation. So by this, I mean an explicit acknowledgement that all this talk of empowerment and action is useless unless people's anxieties and the structural constraints they face are addressed. So in Mr. Wong's speech, he devotes a considerable chunk of it to the struggles of students who feel pigeonholed, the anxieties of graduates and older workers, over housing, job security. And he even talked about how we know in our guts it cannot be business as usual.
The exercise will be organized along 6 pillars in areas like jobs, housing and health, which you also mentioned. But do you think the 6 are comprehensive enough for the times that we're in right now?
Right, yes. So the current exercise is organized along these 6 pillars. We're touching on things like economy, education, lifelong learning, health, living environment, fiscal sustainability, and a national identity. But it wasn't too long ago that SG Together also looked at some of these areas. And I think the elephant in the room is really representation. And this is a similar point that came up, with our Singapore conversation as well. So things like, for example, voluntary welfare organizations and grassroots associations considered more acceptable than more activist civil society groups that advocate for specific interests, right? And if interest groups are supposedly having more opportunities to bring about change, are issues such as the environment and social inequality are perennially deemed more perhaps constructive than the more contentious issues like LGBTQ rights.
Well, the exercise will conclude in a year's time with a report to be published in mid-2023. What happens from there, Grace? Policy changes, perhaps?
Yes, that's right. So with the publication of the report, there's usually policy changes, as with other reports. Usually there's a roadmap where some of these changes are implemented. And perhaps also marking some of the shifts in the way policy is conducted, based on this heavy emphasis on renewed social compacts and contracts. But it's still early days, and we do need to have better sight of how these conversations are being held, with whom they're being held, and exactly what is being discussed.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified of new videos.